When the NHL wrapped up its first 50 years in 1967, it was far and away the smallest and most provincial of North America's 4 professional leagues. With just 6 teams, it could even have been classified as quaint. But in the league's 51st year, a seismic shift would reshape the landscape.
Clarence Campbell, the National Hockey League president, along with the board of directors of the National Hockey League, realized that in order to increase their revenues to where it should be, they needed to double the size of the league.
This year, for the first time, the league will be composed of 12 teams.
So in the 1967-68 season, they introduced 6 new teams. We've got Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, we've got St. Louis, we've got Minnesota, we've got Oakland, and we've got Los Angeles. Rather than it being a league that only went as far west as Chicago, all of a sudden is extending into the wonderful California market.
We have orange of Philadelphia, hockey in orange, and green in Minnesota, and baby blue in Pittsburgh, a color you normally see on religious statuary and baby blankets. And all this was coming to the sport. It was making it more colorful. But it was inevitable, because if hockey didn't grow, it would have shriveled and maybe died.
Twice the teams meant double the players, giving many career minor leaguers a chance to finally play in the NHL. It also extended the careers of several notable veterans, like 36-year-old goaltender Glenn Hall, who became the backbone of the St. Louis Blues, a wise decision given the new league structure.
The East Division was the original 6 teams. The West Division was the 6 new expansion teams.
We know that the expansion teams can't compete for a period of years compared to the old established franchises, so they give their own division where they can make the playoffs.
The first 2 expansion-era Cup finals saw the Canadiens sweep the St. Louis Blues. Although thanks to Hall, the first was closer than expected, with each game decided by 1 goal. But the Habs' victory in 1969 would mark the end of an 8-year run of either Toronto or Montreal winning the Cup. The new decade would bring a new champion, with a bright new star from Parry Sound, Ontario, who from the age of 14 had seemed destined to become the new face of the league.
In the 1960s, the Bruins fell on hard times and dropped to the bottom of the league. The fans were getting a little restless. And the word was out now that we had this phenom. And when he got here, magical things started to happen to hockey in the next 10 years.
Orr breaks for the net. Scores! Orr. Shot. Score! Score! Bobby Orr! Orr, a backhander. Score!
First time I saw Bobby Orr, and I sat there like this for 2.5 hours, because I had never seen anything like it.
What a save by Bobby Orr! He can play goal too.
Talk about a guy who would electrify a rink when he gathered the puck in his own end and did his thing like nobody else ever did it.
Goes behind the net. How to open it?
Teammates sometimes were giving it one of these when Bobby did his thing, and maybe even a few opponents. He left opponents in his exhaust fumes.
You always like to see somebody that's that good of a player do what they do and go, pretty cool.
Intercepted by Orr. He breaks. Over the line. Drills one. Scores!
Bobby Orr revolutionized the game. He changed the game forever.
You know, I'm not trying to be modest, but I never thought about changing the game. I was playing a game that I loved. I was realizing a dream. The only thing they said to me is be careful. You know, when you go up the ice, try to pick your spots. But it didn't take long for the players to understand how I played.
Closing with Orr. Orr in. Shoots and scores as he was spilled in the corner.
I didn't think about scoring X number of goals. My goal was to be on a Stanley Cup team.
For Bobby and the Bruins, that would happen in 1970, ending Boston's 29-year Stanley Cup drought, capped by Orr himself. A moment now frozen in time.
Bobby Orr behind the net to Sanderson. Orr! Bobby Orr!
Bobby Orr was Peter Pan, and on May 10th, 1970, when he scores the cup-winning goal on Mother's Day in a steamy Boston garden, he flew. He flew through the air. Peter Pan flies through the air. It was one of those moments that captured hockey.
each time I see Glenn Hall. Glenn says, "Is that the only goal you ever scored?"
In the early 1970s, as Orr was revolutionizing and reshaping the role of an NHL defenseman, his Bruins were busy setting dozens of scoring records, many of those by center Phil Esposito, who led the NHL in goals 6 straight seasons, scoring an unheard of 76 in the 1970-71 season. A year later, Espo had 66, and the Bruins another Stanley Cup, their second and last of the Bobby Orr era. By 1973, the NHL had grown to 16 teams. But for the next several years, the league, now admittedly a bit rougher and tougher, would come to be defined by just one, and their self-described intimidating style of play. Although the Philadelphia Flyers weren't always the Broad Street bullies.
There was the big bad Bruins in St. Louis under Bowman and stuff. They were beating the crap out of us physically.
We've got a fight.
We just got bigger and stronger and tougher, and we started returning the favors, started beating up other teams. I loved it. Give our team a personality, and in a physical sport, if you're the most physical, that's a big advantage.
Dave the Hammer Schultz, 400-plus penalty minutes through the course of the season. Bob Kelly, Moose DuPont, these were tough boys. When the opposing teams came to town, they all of a sudden got the Philadelphia flu. They didn't really want to play in Philadelphia too badly because they knew that there was going to be a war one way or another. The other owners were horrified at the Philadelphia Flyers. Wait a minute, what happened to our beautiful game?
We got kind of tattooed with the Broad Street bully thing, but if you really looked at the team, we had finesse and good hockey players. You don't win through bullying. You win through team play and a system we played in that Fred Sherrill set up for us. And you still have to score goals, you still have to make defensive plays. The Flyers had all of that through that time.
In 1974, after just 7 years in the league, the physical Flyers became the first expansion team to win the Stanley Cup. They outmuscled, and perhaps more rewardingly, outskated the Boston Bruins in 6 games, led by the spectacular play of goaltender Bernie Perron.
Get in the playoffs, you feel the excitement, and the crowd elevates you to a different level. That makes you perform at a different level. It's a beautiful thing.
The next year, 1975, Perron was again the hero, with the Flyers prevailing over the Buffalo Sabres. It was the first time in the history of the league that the Stanley Cup final was played without an original 6 team. But to the everlasting thanks of much of the old guard, that would soon change.
In 1976, the Flyers were the barbarians at the gate, and it needed the Canadians to rebalance the game.
We felt that we had a lot of pressure on our shoulders throughout the league to kind of change the way that people thought that the game should be played.
Canadians were tough too, and they weren't angels, but the Canadians came down more on the good side. Larry Robinson hitting Gary Dornhofer and actually denting the boards. He hit them so hard. Really announced that the Canadians were not going to take anything.
If you want a rodeo, we'll give you a rodeo. If you want a skating game, we'll give you a skating game. They could play the Philadelphia Flyers straight up and beat them at their game if they had to, but they could also beat them on the scoreboard. That was such a team.
The Canadiens not only won that cup, but 3 more as well, with what might have been the most impressive collection of talent ever assembled on the ice.
They were an absolutely spectacular team. Larry Robinson, Serge Savard, and Guy Lapointe, and the great forwards Guy Lafleur and Steve Shutt and Jacques Lemaire.
He had a great goaltender in Ken Dryden. He had speed from Cournoyer, who was known as the Road Runner. He had the best checker in the game in Bob Gainey.
We had 9 members of the Hall of Fame on the same team.
The 1976-77 Canadians, they lost 8 games all year. It was the best team that hockey's ever seen.
In that one remarkable season, Montreal lost just a single home game, and its 132 total points remain the most in NHL history. The Canadiens' offense was nearly unstoppable. Steve Shutt had 60 goals, at the time the most ever by a left wing. While the defense, led by Larry Robinson and goaltender Ken Dryden, was nearly impenetrable. Fittingly, the Habs capped their second consecutive cup with a 4-game sweep of the Bruins, perhaps the only acceptable result for the demanding mastermind behind their bench.
Scotty Bowman was brilliant. He was coaching analytically before anyone had heard of the term analytics, and no one ever ran a bench with more acuity.
He was ahead of just about everybody in the game, but more than anything, he had to be master's psychologist because he had a group of the most talented players on the planet who most nights could beat any team in the league. So he had to find a way to keep them on task, and he did. And so for that very reason, there'd be mumbling and complaining about him, but they played for him.
364 days of the year, we couldn't stand him, and on the 365th day, we got our Stanley Cup rings.
Anything less than the Stanley Cup was a bad year.
During the 1970s run, Mayor Jean Drapeau, and he didn't mean this in any kind of a flippant way, issued a press release saying the Canadian Stanley Cup parade will follow the usual route. You looked at the schedule, and you knew roughly what day you were going to have to cut class, what lamp pole you were going to climb at the corner of Peel and St. Catherine Street to watch the Canadian Stanley Cup parade go by.
And when that parade did go by, as it did 4 consecutive years in the late 1970s, there was one player everyone wanted to see, the visual image of the Flying Frenchman, Guy Lafleur.
He was born to be a hockey player. Guy played just from the seat of his pants. He wasn't an X's and O's type player.
For a game at 8 o'clock, he would be in the dressing room fully dressed at 3.
Nobody wants to practice against him. He was too good, he was too fast, and he had the stamina. He was always ready to go and skate and skate and skate. On the bench, we had the best seat of them all. Just see him going by the bench and flying in his hair, going back and then shooting the puck.
His hair was long enough and he moved fast enough that his hair would stream out behind, and when he would start up, it would kind of flip up, and then it would stream out. It was how people could almost connect to the speed.
Every time I was on the ice, I was the happiest guy in the world, so especially the form. Wearing the Montreal Canadiens uniform was a dream come true, and I was very, very proud of that.
Lafleur scored 560 NHL goals and 58 more in the playoffs, eventually leading the Habs to their 22nd Stanley Cup, with Montreal becoming the first of 3 straight dynasties that would go on to redefine the game. When the New York Islanders won the 1980 Stanley Cup, it marked both the beginning of the expansion era's second dynasty and the culmination of a master plan that came together through the draft, piece by Hall of Fame piece. The core of the Islanders featured defenseman Dennis Potvin, center Brian Trottier, left wing Clark Gillies, goaltender Billy Smith, and one of the greatest goal scorers in league history, Mike Bossy.
When I sat down with him and his agent, Michael turned to me and he said, "What is a 50-goal scorer worth to you?" And I said, "Are you telling me you're going to score 50? And he says,
It'll be Dean Talafis against Michael.
We drafted you to score goals. Go out and score goals. At the same time, I knew I was coming onto a team that had tons of promise. So in that way, I was very enthusiastic.
Bossy, of course, did become a 50-goal scorer. 9 times, in fact, in his first 9 seasons. And although it did take the Isles a few years longer than they expected, that promise did eventually translate into championships. In the early 1980s, the Islanders played the game any way their opponents wanted. They were as tough as they were talented. And in their 4 Stanley Cup finals, they only lost a total of 3 games.
The New York Islanders win 4 straight games for their 4th straight Stanley Cup.
There's 16 guys on that team that won 4 Stanley Cups in a row. I mean, that's amazing. There's no way a team like that will ever exist today.
I can tell you one record that will never be broken, and that's 19 straight playoff series wins. Fabulous, fabulous dynasty.
A 20th straight series win would have given the Islanders their 5th straight cup. It was, however, not to be. There was a new dynasty on the horizon, led by the most prolific scorer the game would ever see.
When Bobby Orr came in, he was a can't miss. When Connor McDavid came in, he was a can't miss. Crosby came in, he was a can't miss. When I came in, it was, well, maybe, because people didn't know if I was big enough or strong enough to play in the National Hockey League.
Everybody thought he'd be a bloodstain on the boards. Everything looked wrong. He was hunched over a little too much. His helmet was flimsy, so he looked like he was vulnerable.
It didn't take long for Wayne Gretzky to disprove those doubters. In his rookie season, at the age of just 19, he led the NHL in scoring, and then kept on going, smashing records and changing the game. A true hockey savant.
I attacked avenues that other guys hadn't in the past. A, playing behind the net. If a team tried to flush you out, then you came out the other way. If they stopped and just stayed there, then you waited and looked for the open man. I was doing something that they weren't sure how to defend because nobody had really ever done it before. With that came my work ethic, and it just sort of all added up to being Wayne Gretzky.
He had an amazing desire, his anticipation, his spatial awareness, right? That's his magic, his spatial awareness. They always say 5 sticks are better than 1, and Wayne knew that.
Wayne played chess, and he was playing 10, 20 moves ahead of everybody. His anticipation and his knowledge of everybody else on the ice and their space and their timing and where they were and how fast they were moving can only be described as pure genius.
My dad really believed that you could teach that at a young age, and I used to watch Hockey Night Canada with a big pad of paper with the blue line, red line nets, and I would just follow the puck, and I wouldn't even look down. I'd just follow the puck on the paper with a pen and watch where the puck was the whole time. And I was like a sponge. I took all that in.
In the 1981-82 season, Gretzky scored an NHL record 92 goals. But the great one was far from a one-man band. In the late 80s, his Edmonton Oilers won 4 Stanley Cups in 5 years, with arguably the most skilled and explosive team to ever play in the NHL.
Mark Messier could do everything. He was a consummate hockey player. He could score, he could check. When he needed to be mean, he was mean. In many ways, in the lineage of a guy like Gordie Howe, Messier became so feared.
Messier up the center, offensive right corner dump. Curry with a one-timer.
They had a clearly defined style. They used to tell you, we're going to outscore you. You might get 5, we're going to get 7.
Gretzky to Curry, score! Here's Coffey on a rush, right in, shoots, scores! 24-year-old Paul Coffey.
Let them go, let them play, let them have fun. You know, that was the whole philosophy of that team.
Wayne Gretzky played 10 years in Edmonton and led the NHL in scoring in 8 of those.
Cutting inside of Hoffmeyer, score!
and 4 times topped 200 points. The only NHL player to ever reach that mark. But following the 1987-88 season, all of that magic in Edmonton would come to a shocking end.
The Edmonton Oilers have agreed to trade Wayne Gretzky to Los Angeles.
Basically, it was a death in our family. We lost the king of the game.
Promised Mess I wouldn't do this.
Just complete devastation for myself personally, I know for all my other teammates, and of course the city of Edmonton.
How do you let somebody like that go out of your life that you've spent so much time with? I mean, that whole city went into mourning.
What did it look like when he put that Kings jersey on? I'm sure for many Oiler fans it put a tear in their eye, and you might have thought that hockey would never be the same.
In truth, with the great one in LA, hockey never was the same.
The lasting impression that I will have is being at his first game in Los Angeles and seeing all the movie stars there and seeing people who had never been to hockey games there applauding Wayne and how he transcended the game.
I'm not sure there'd be any teams in the Sun Belt without Wayne. I don't think there'd be a Ducks. I don't think there'd be a Panthers or a Lightning. That became a huge factor in how the NHL grew.
Wayne, however, was the same great scorer in LA. And by the age of 29, on the verge of passing his idol Gordie Howe as the NHL's all-time leading scorer, in, of all places, Edmonton.
It was only fitting that it should happen in Edmonton because I'd played so many nights there and people have been so good to me.
He's done it! Wayne Gretzky, the great one, has become the greatest of them all!
I remember saying to my dad, it just doesn't seem like I should be knocking off Gordie Howe. Because I started watching him when I was 5 years old on TV, and there was just something about him that was so magnetic. And so Gordie became my guy. I had to wear number 9. I even, when I was getting a haircut, asked the barber if he could give me a Gordie Howe haircut. That's how much I idolized him. And then I got so lucky in my life, I got to meet him when I was 10. He was the most humble man I've ever met. Over the years, when I was chasing down some of his records, we became very good friends, and that made it very special.
When he finally finished his career with the New York Rangers, inappropriately 1999, Wayne Gretzky was the holder of just about every NHL scoring record imaginable. And in most cases, so far ahead of anyone else, it's likely they would stand forever. No matter which new great stars would come along in the next 25 years, and even beyond.